The sound of a shattering plate echoed through the dimly lit kitchen as Nora Kendrick flinched, her trembling fingers clutching the edge of the worn wooden table. It wasn't the first time her husband's rage had filled their small Missouri farmhouse, but as she locked eyes with the furious man towering over her, she knew it would be the last time she'd endure it. 3 years, Nora whispered to herself as she slipped through the back door later that night, a small bundle of possessions clutched to her chest. The year was 1875, and at 22, she was escaping the prison her marriage had become. The cool September air kissed the fresh bruise forming beneath her eye as she disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind the only life she'd known since she was 19. The stagecoach depot in Liberty was bustling with early morning activity when Nora arrived, her face partially concealed by the high collar of her coat and the wide brim of her bonnet. She counted the meager savings she'd managed to hide away over the months, just enough for a ticket west. Somewhere far, somewhere new. "Where to, madam?" asked the ticket agent, barely glancing up from his ledger. "As far west as this will take me," she replied, sliding the money across the counter. The agent counted the coins and nodded. "That'll get you to Silverridge, Colorado territory. Coach leaves in 20 minutes. 3 days later, Nora stepped down from the stagecoach into the dusty main street of Silverridge, a mining town nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. The journey had been long and uncomfortable, but with each mile, she'd felt the weight of her past growing lighter. Here, no one would know her. No one would know about the bruises hidden beneath her clothes or the fear that had defined her life for so long. The town was smaller than she'd expected, a single main street lined with wooden buildings. A saloon, a general store, a small church, and what appeared to be a hotel at the far end. Miners and cowboys moved through the street, paying little attention to the newly arrived woman clutching her small bag of possessions. Nora made her way to the hotel, hoping to secure a room for a few nights while she determined what to do next. Her remaining money wouldn't last long, and she knew she needed to find work quickly. "Rooms 50 cents a night," said the gruff older woman behind the counter. "Breakfast included." Nora paid for 3 nights, trying to ignore the woman's lingering gaze on the fading bruise beneath her eye. "There's work at the laundry if you're looking," the woman offered, her voice softening slightly as she handed over a key. "They're always needing help." The laundry proved to be a blessing. By the end of her first day in Silverridge, Nora had secured employment washing the clothes of miners and townsfolk alike. The work was hard and the hours long, but the owner, Mrs. Sullivan, was kind and didn't ask questions about Nora's past, or the healing marks on her arms that became visible when she rolled up her sleeves to work. 2 weeks passed, and Nora established a quiet routine working at the laundry from dawn until late afternoon, taking her meals at the small cafe near the hotel and keeping to herself. She'd moved from the hotel to a small room above the laundry that Mrs. Sullivan offered at a reduced rent in exchange for Nora occasionally watching her young children. It was during her 3rd week in Silverridge when Nora first encountered him. She was carrying a basket of clean linens to deliver to the hotel when a commotion in the street caught her attention. A group of rowdy miners had surrounded a man on horseback, their shouts growing increasingly hostile. "You can't just ride in here and take our claims, Garrett," one of the miners yelled, stepping closer to the horse. The rider, tall and broad-shouldered, remained calm despite the tension. "I'm not taking anything that isn't legally mine," he replied, his voice steady. "The deed's been filed and registered. You boys were mining on unclaimed land. That land's been good to us for months," another miner protested. "And now it's mine," the rider said firmly. "I'm offering fair wages for those who want to work it proper. Otherwise, move on." The confrontation might have escalated further if not for the timely arrival of the town sheriff. As the crowd dispersed, the rider turned his horse and, for a brief moment, his eyes met Nora's. She quickly lowered her gaze and hurried past, but not before noticing the intensity in his blue eyes and the way his sun-bronzed face softened when he looked at her. Later that afternoon, as Nora was finishing her work at the laundry, the bell above the door jingled. She looked up to find the same man from the street standing in the doorway, hat in hand. Up close, she could see he was younger than she initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with a strong jawline and light brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Afternoon, madam," he said, nodding politely. "I've some shirts that could use washing." Nora nodded, keeping her eyes downcast as she reached for the bundle he offered. "It'll be ready by tomorrow afternoon," she said softly. "Much obliged," he replied, then paused. "Name's Preston Garrett. I own the Silver Creek Ranch just outside of town." "Nora," she responded, deliberately omitting her surname. "50 cents for the washing, Mr. Garrett." He placed the money on the counter but didn't immediately turn to leave. "You're new to Silverridge," he observed. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Nora answered simply, still avoiding his gaze. Preston Garrett seemed to sense her discomfort and didn't press further. "Until tomorrow then, Miss Nora," he said, placing his hat back on his head before departing. "Mrs. Sullivan emerged from the back room after he left, a knowing smile on her face. "Preston Garrett's a good man," she commented. "Built that ranch from nothing after coming back from the war. Doesn't come into town much, though. Interesting that he brought his washing in himself, rather than sending one of his hands." Nora said nothing, focusing intently on folding the linens before her, but she couldn't help wondering about the man with the kind eyes who seemed so different from the miners and drifters that populated most of Silverridge. The next day, Nora found herself glancing toward the door more often than usual. When Preston Garrett finally appeared in the late afternoon, she had his freshly laundered and pressed shirts ready. "These look better than new," he commented, examining her work. "You have skilled hands, Miss Nora." "Thank you," she replied, allowing herself to meet his gaze briefly. In the daylight streaming through the window, his eyes were the color of a summer sky. "I was wondering," he began, then seemed to reconsider his words. "That is, I'm hosting a small gathering at my ranch this Saturday. Nothing fancy, just some neighbors and friends. There'll be food and music. You'd be welcome to attend." Nora was caught off guard by the invitation. I don't think I could, Mr. Garrett, but thank you," he nodded, accepting her refusal with grace. "The invitation stands, should you change your mind. My foreman's wife, Mrs. Tucker, will be coming into town tomorrow. She could accompany you out to the ranch if you decide to join us." After he left, Nora found herself torn. Part of her, the part still raw with fear and mistrust, warned against accepting any man's invitation. But another part, a quieter voice that had been silenced for too long, whispered of the possibility of friendship and connection in this new place she now called home. By Friday, curiosity had gotten the better of her. When Mrs. Tucker, a cheerful woman in her 40s, stopped by the laundry to extend the invitation personally, Nora surprised herself by accepting. "Wonderful," Mrs. Tucker exclaimed. "I'll come collect you around 4 tomorrow." It's not a far ride to the ranch. Saturday afternoon found Nora nervously preparing for the gathering. She had only one dress suitable for a social occasion, a simple blue cotton with white trim that she'd managed to bring with her from Missouri. As she fastened the buttons, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above her wash basin. The bruise beneath her eye had faded, but others remained yellowish marks on her arms and a deeper bruise on her shoulder that was still tender to the touch. She covered what she could with her shawl and tried not to think about the scars that no fabric could hide. Mrs. Tucker arrived promptly at 4, driving a small wagon. "You look lovely, dear," she said as Nora climbed up beside her. "Preston will be pleased you decided to come." The mention of Preston's first name and the implication in Mrs. Tucker's words made Nora flush slightly. "I'm sure Mr. Garrett is simply being neighborly," she replied. Mrs. Tucker's knowing smile suggested otherwise, but she changed the subject as they left town behind and followed the winding road toward the foothills. "Preston came out here after the war with nothing but determination. Worked as a ranch hand for 2 years before staking a claim on some land nobody thought worth much. Turned out there was both good grazing and a silver vein running through it. Now the Silver Creek Ranch is one of the most prosperous in the territory." The ranch came into view as they crested a hill, a sprawling property with a large main house, several outbuildings, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed. A group of people had already gathered in the yard where tables had been set up, and lanterns hung from posts in preparation for the evening ahead. Nora's nervousness increased as they approached. It had been years since she'd attended any social function. Her husband had preferred to keep her isolated, away from friends or family who might notice the marks he left on her. Preston Garrett spotted them as soon as the wagon pulled into the yard. He strode over, a warm smile lighting his features. "Mrs. Tucker, Miss Nora, welcome," he said, helping each woman down from the wagon. His hand lingered on Nora's just a moment longer than necessary. "I'm glad you decided to come." "Thank you for inviting me," Nora replied, suddenly conscious of how close he stood. In the late afternoon sunlight, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of days spent under the open sky. The gathering was more enjoyable than Nora had anticipated. The ranch hands and their families, along with neighboring ranchers and a few townspeople from Silverridge, created an atmosphere of genuine warmth. A fiddler and banjo player provided lively music, and tables laden with food offered more variety than Nora had seen in months. Throughout the evening, Preston moved among his guests with easy confidence, but Nora noticed how often his gaze sought her out across the yard. As twilight descended, and lanterns cast a golden glow over the gathering, he made his way to where she stood slightly apart from the dancers. "Would you care to dance, Miss Nora?" he asked, extending his hand. Nora hesitated. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a dancer, Mr. Garrett." "Preston," he corrected gently. "And neither am I, truth be told. We can be awkward together." Something in his self-deprecating humor broke through her reserve, and she found herself placing her hand in his. "Very well, Preston." They joined the other couples as the musicians struck up a lively reel. Preston's hand at her waist was respectful, his touch light as he guided her through the steps. When she stumbled slightly, his grip tightened just enough to steady her, and the smile he gave her held no judgment. As the evening wore on, Nora found herself relaxing in Preston's company. They shared a plate of food at one of the tables, and he told her stories of his time in the war and his early days in Colorado. He asked about her life before Silverridge, and though she gave only vague answers, he didn't press for details. "Would you like to see the rest of the ranch?" he asked as the party began to wind down. When she hesitated, he added, "Mrs. Tucker could accompany us if you'd prefer." "No," Nora surprised herself by saying, "that won't be necessary." They walked away from the lantern light, and Preston pointed out the various buildings and corrals. The night was clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. When they reached a small rise overlooking a creek that gleamed silver in the moonlight, Preston stopped. "This is my favorite spot on the property," he said quietly. "I come here to think sometimes." "It's beautiful," Nora agreed, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as a cool breeze whispered through the grass. "Much like its visitor tonight," Preston said, his voice low. Nora felt her cheeks warm at the compliment, but it also triggered a wave of shame. "You're kind to say so, but you don't need to flatter me." Preston turned to face her, his expression serious. "It's not flattery, Nora, you are beautiful." She shook her head, unconsciously touching the fading bruise beneath her eye. "You don't know me, Preston. You don't know where I've come from or what I've." Her voice trailed off. "I know enough," he said gently. "I know you're brave, I know you work hard, I know you came to Silverridge alone, seeking a fresh start." "How could you know that?" she asked, surprised. A faint smile crossed his lips. "Small towns have few secrets, Nora, and I've made it my business to learn what I could about you." "Then you know I'm damaged goods," she said bitterly, turning away from him. "I should return to the party." Preston caught her hand as she moved to leave. "Nora, wait, please." When she paused, he continued, "Whatever happened before you came here, whoever hurt you, it doesn't define who you are to me." The gentleness in his voice nearly undid her. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Then help me understand," he replied, releasing her hand but remaining close. "If you're willing." And so, under the vast Colorado sky, Nora found herself speaking of things she'd never shared with anyone: her hasty marriage at 19 to escape her strict father, the way her husband's charm had masked a violent temper, the 3 years of escalating abuse she'd endured before finally finding the courage to flee. Preston listened without interruption, his face compassionate but with an undercurrent of controlled anger directed not at her, but at the man who had hurt her. When she finally fell silent, he took a deep breath before speaking. "Thank you for trusting me with your story," he said. "It only confirms what I already believed about your strength and courage." "I don't feel strong," Nora admitted. "Most days I feel broken." "Broken things can be mended," Preston said softly, "and sometimes they're stronger at the broken places." They stood in companionable silence for a moment before he spoke again. "I should escort you back. Mrs. Tucker will be wondering where you've gone." As they walked back toward the lights and music, Preston stopped suddenly. "Nora, I want you to know something. I'm not a perfect man. I've made my share of mistakes, but I would never, ever raise my hand to a woman in anger. That's not the kind of man I am or ever will be." Nora met his gaze, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I believe you," she said softly, realizing with some surprise that she truly did. In the weeks that followed, Preston became a regular visitor to the laundry. Sometimes he brought shirts that didn't really need washing. Other times he simply stopped by to talk with Nora during her afternoon break. Occasionally, he brought small gifts: a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry, once a jar of honey from the hives on his ranch. Mrs. Sullivan observed these visits with amused approval. "That man is sweet on you, Nora," she commented one afternoon after Preston had left. "And unless I'm much mistaken, you're not entirely indifferent to him either." Nora couldn't deny it. Something was growing between her and Preston, a tender friendship that held the promise of more. Yet fear still held her back from fully embracing those feelings. The scars of her past, both physical and emotional, weren't easily forgotten. One cool October evening, Preston invited her to dinner at the town's small restaurant. As they shared a meal of roast beef and potatoes, he spoke of his plans for the ranch and the coming winter. "I've been thinking," he said, watching her over the rim of his coffee cup, "the laundry must be difficult work, especially as the weather turns colder." "It's honest work," Nora replied with a slight shrug. "Mrs. Sullivan is fair, and the room above the laundry stays warm enough." Preston nodded thoughtfully. "I don't mean to speak against your employment, I only—" He paused, seeming uncharacteristically hesitant. "The ranch house is large, too large for just me, and with winter coming, I find myself in need of someone to help manage the household." Nora set down her fork, suddenly understanding his meaning. "Are you offering me a position at your ranch?" "Yes," he said, then quickly added, "with proper accommodations, of course. The housekeeper's quarters are comfortable and private. Mrs. Tucker would be there during the days as well." "I see," Nora said, uncertain how to feel about the offer. On one hand, it would be a step up from the laundry. On the other, it would place her in Preston's home, under his roof, a situation that carried its own complications given their growing attachment. "You don't need to answer now," Preston assured her. "Think about it. The position is yours if you want it, but I understand if you prefer your independence in town." That night, Nora lay awake in her small room, weighing Preston's offer. The rational part of her knew it was a good opportunity: better pay, easier work, a more comfortable living situation. But the part of her that still woke from nightmares of her husband's rage worried about putting herself in a position of dependency on another man, even one as kind as Preston. In the morning, she still hadn't reached a decision. She went about her work at the laundry mechanically, her thoughts elsewhere. It was nearly closing time when the door opened, and a stranger entered, a well-dressed man with a hard face and cold eyes that widened in recognition when they fell on Nora. "Well, well," he drawled, removing his hat. "If it isn't Mrs. Thomas Kendrick." Nora froze, the shirt she'd been folding slipping from her suddenly numb fingers. "George," she whispered, recognizing her husband's older brother. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you, dear sister-in-law," he replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Thomas has been beside himself with worry. A man has a right to know where his wife has run off to, doesn't he?" "I'm not going back," Nora said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Tell Thomas our marriage is over." George laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet laundry. "That's not for you to decide, Nora. A wife belongs with her husband. Thomas sent me to bring you home, and that's what I intend to do." "You can't force me to go with you," Nora said, backing away as George stepped closer. "Can't I?" he replied, reaching for her arm. "A husband has rights, Nora." The law's on our side, not yours." Before his hand could close around her wrist, the door opened again, and Preston entered. He took in the scene with a quick glance Nora's pale face, the threatening stance of the stranger, and moved swiftly to position himself between them. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "This doesn't concern you, mister," George said dismissively. "This woman is my brother's wife, and I've come to take her home." Preston's expression didn't change, but Nora saw his shoulders tense. "The lady doesn't appear to want to go with you," he observed. "And in these parts we respect a woman's wishes." George's face darkened. "Listen here." "No, you listen," Preston interrupted, his voice still even but with an edge of steel beneath the politeness. "Miss Nora is under my protection. If she doesn't wish to return with you, she won't be going anywhere." "Your protection?" George sneered. "And who might you be?" "Preston Garrett," he replied simply. "I own the Silver Creek Ranch and a fair portion of the mining interests in this region. I also count the sheriff and judge among my close friends, so I suggest you reconsider whatever you came here to do." George glanced between Preston and Nora, clearly weighing his options. "This isn't over," he finally said, jamming his hat back on his head. "Thomas won't give up his wife so easily." "She's not his wife anymore," Preston stated firmly. "And if either of you come near her again, you'll regret it. That's not a threat, it's a promise." After George stormed out, Nora sank onto a nearby chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "He found me," she whispered, more to herself than to Preston. "How did he find me?" Preston knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. "He's gone now, Nora, and he won't be back if he knows what's good for him." "You don't know Thomas," she said, her voice hollow, "or his brother." "They won't give up." "Neither will I," Preston replied with quiet determination. "Nora, look at me." When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, "I meant what I said. You're under my protection now if you'll accept it." "Why would you do this?" she asked. "Why would you risk making enemies for someone you barely know?" Preston's expression softened. "I think you know why, Nora. I care for you, more than I should, perhaps, given how short a time we've known each other, but my feelings are real and they're not going to change." Nora felt tears welling in her eyes. "I'm not worth the trouble, Preston. I'm just a runaway wife with too many scars." "Those scars," he said, gently touching the fading mark on her cheekbone. "They're proof of what you've survived. They don't make you less beautiful to me, they make you more so." The tenderness in his touch and the sincerity in his eyes broke something loose within Nora, a dam of emotion she'd held back for too long. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as Preston gathered her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the only other man who had ever claimed to love her. That night, Nora moved to the ranch, not as a housekeeper but as a guest under Preston's protection. Mrs. Tucker, upon hearing the situation, immediately prepared the best guest room and fussed over Nora like a mother hen. Preston, true to his word, sent word to the sheriff about George Kendrick's visit and the potential for trouble. The next few days passed in tense anticipation, but there was no sign of George. Gradually, Nora began to relax into the rhythms of ranch life. She insisted on helping with household tasks despite Mrs. Tucker's protests that she was a guest, not a servant. The work gave her purpose and helped distract her from worry about her husband's brother and what he might do. Preston was often busy with ranch business, but he made time each evening to sit with Nora on the wide porch that wrapped around the house. They would watch the sunset together, talking of small things at first, then gradually sharing deeper thoughts and memories. Nora learned about Preston's family back east, his experiences in the war, and his dreams for the future of his ranch. In turn, she found herself opening up about her childhood in Pennsylvania before her family moved to Missouri, her love of books, and her own secret dreams that had been buried during her marriage. One evening, as they sat side by side in comfortable silence watching the stars appear, Preston turned to her with an unusually serious expression. "Nora, there's something I need to tell you." Her heart quickened with apprehension. "What is it?" "I sent a telegram to a lawyer friend in St. Louis," he said. "Asked him about your situation. According to him, you have grounds for divorce based on cruelty. It would take time and there might be obstacles, but it's possible to legally end your marriage, especially if you can prove mistreatment." Nora sat very still, absorbing this information. A divorce, she said slowly, testing the word. It wasn't something respectable women sought, and yet the possibility of being truly free of Thomas filled her with unexpected hope. It's your decision, Preston added quickly. I just wanted you to know it's an option. You don't have to live in fear of being forced back to him. Thank you, Nora said softly, reaching for his hand. For everything you've done. Preston's fingers entwined with hers. I'd do a lot more if you'd let me, Nora. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Nora knew Preston cared for her deeply, perhaps even loved her, but he had been careful not to pressure her, understanding the wounds she still carried from her marriage. I care for you too, Preston, she admitted. More than I thought possible. But I'm still legally bound to another man, and I'm afraid of what would happen if we… I understand, he said gently. And I can wait, Nora. However long it takes for you to be truly free, I'll wait. The weeks passed, and autumn deepened toward winter. Nora settled more comfortably into life at the ranch, and her relationship with Preston grew stronger with each passing day. They were careful to maintain propriety. Nora still occupied the guest room, and Mrs. Tucker's presence provided both chaperonage and company during the days when Preston was working. In early December, a letter arrived from Preston's lawyer friend in St. Louis. Divorce proceedings had been initiated based on Nora's sworn affidavit describing the abuse she had suffered. The lawyer cautioned that Thomas Kendrick would likely contest the divorce, but expressed confidence that the courts would ultimately rule in Nora's favor given the evidence. The letter brought mixed emotions for Nora: relief that legal steps were being taken, anxiety about confronting her past, and a tentative hope for the future. Preston, sensing her turmoil, suggested a ride to clear her head. They rode to the creek that had become their special place on the property, now partially frozen in the winter cold. As they stood beside the water, Preston suddenly took both her hands in his. Nora, he began, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. I know your divorce isn't final yet, and I know you're still healing from the past, but I need you to know that whenever you're ready, if you ever are, I want to make a life with you. Nora's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. Preston, you don't need to answer now, he said quickly. I'm not asking for promises. I just want you to know that I love you, and I believe we could build something beautiful together. Tears stung Nora's eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow or fear. For the first time in years, she felt the warmth of genuine happiness spreading through her chest. I love you too, she whispered, the words both frightening and freeing. Preston's face lit with joy, and he leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he kissed her with a tenderness that made her previous experiences of love seem like pale shadows. Winter settled over Silverridge and the Silver Creek Ranch, bringing with it holiday preparations and a sense of anticipation. Christmas approached, and Nora found herself helping to decorate the ranch house with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. The festive atmosphere, combined with the growing certainty of her feelings for Preston, created a happiness she had almost forgotten was possible. 3 days before Christmas, the sheriff rode out to the ranch with troubling news. Thomas Kendrick had been spotted in Denver, making inquiries about Silverridge and his wife's whereabouts. He's coming for her, Preston said grimly after the sheriff departed. We need to be prepared. Nora felt the familiar cold grip of fear, but it was different now. She wasn't alone anymore. What should we do? We face him, Preston replied simply. Together, and we make it clear that you're not going anywhere with him. Thomas Kendrick arrived in Silverridge on Christmas Eve, accompanied by his brother George. They made no secret of their purpose, announcing loudly in the saloon that they had come to reclaim a runaway wife. Word reached the ranch within hours through one of Preston's hands who had been in town for supplies. Stay here, Preston told Nora, preparing to ride into town. I'll handle this. No, she said firmly, surprising herself with her own resolve. I need to face him, Preston. I need to look him in the eye and tell him myself that our marriage is over. Otherwise, he'll never stop coming after me. Preston studied her face, then nodded slowly. All right, but I'll be with you every step of the way. They rode into Silverridge together, the winter sun low in the sky as they approached the town. Nora's heart pounded in her chest, but she sat straight in the saddle, drawing strength from Preston's steady presence beside her. They found Thomas and George at the hotel, preparing to ride out to the ranch. The confrontation that followed was tense but brief. Thomas, a handsome man with cold eyes, demanded that Nora return with him to Missouri. When she refused, his charm quickly gave way to the ugliness she knew so well. "You're my wife," he snarled, stepping toward her threateningly. "You have no right to leave me." "I had every right," Nora replied, standing her ground. "You forfeited any claim on me the first time you raised your hand in anger." Thomas lunged forward, but Preston was faster, stepping between them and pushing Thomas back with enough force to send him stumbling. "She's not going anywhere with you," Preston stated, his voice dangerously calm. "Divorce proceedings have already begun. If you're wise, you'll accept it and return to Missouri." "You can't have my wife," Thomas spat, his face contorted with rage. "She doesn't belong to you or anyone else," Preston replied. "She belongs to herself, and she's chosen to stay here in Silverridge." Thomas reached for the gun at his hip, but the sheriff, who had been watching from nearby, intervened before the situation could escalate further. "That's enough, Kendrick," he said firmly. "I suggest you and your brother leave town before sunrise. If you're still here tomorrow, I'll arrest you for disturbing the peace on Christmas Day." Faced with the combined authority of the sheriff and the obvious support of the townspeople who had gathered to watch, Thomas and George had little choice but to back down. With a final venomous glare at Nora and Preston, they departed, promising that the matter wasn't settled. But it was settled, at least in all the ways that mattered. As Nora and Preston rode back to the ranch that evening, a light snow began to fall, transforming the landscape into a glistening wonderland. Despite the confrontation, or perhaps because of it, Nora felt lighter than she had in years. She had faced her abuser and stood firm. She had claimed her right to a life of her own choosing. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold. Nora woke early and made her way downstairs to find Preston already up, stoking the fire in the main room where a small pine tree had been decorated with handmade ornaments and candles. "Merry Christmas," he said, smiling as she entered. "Merry Christmas," she replied, returning his smile. "It feels like my first real Christmas in years." They exchanged simple gifts: a hand-knitted scarf from Nora, a beautiful leather-bound journal from Preston. But the real gift came later that morning when Preston took her hands in his as they sat before the fire. "Nora," he said softly, "I know your divorce isn't final yet, and I know we need to wait, but I want to give you this as a promise." He pressed a small velvet pouch into her palm. Inside was a delicate silver ring set with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," Preston explained. "She gave it to me before she passed, said I should give it to the woman I chose to spend my life with." Tears filled Nora's eyes as she looked from the ring to Preston's hopeful face. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Not as beautiful as you," he replied, gently tracing the fading scar on her cheek. "Every part of you, Nora, your strength, your courage, your heart, you're beautiful to me." 6 months later, on a perfect June day, Nora's divorce was finally granted. That same evening, as the sun set over the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, Preston Garrett and Nora Kendrick, soon to be Nora Garrett, stood beside the creek that had become their special place and exchanged private vows of love and commitment. The legal wedding would come later, but this moment, this promise made with only the mountains and sky as witnesses, was theirs alone. As Preston slipped his mother's ring onto Nora's finger, now as an official engagement rather than just a promise, she marveled at how far she had come from that frightened woman who had fled her home in the night with nothing but bruises and desperate hope. "Thank you for seeing me," she said softly, looking up into the face of the man who had shown her what love truly meant. "For seeing past the scars." "Those scars are part of your story, Nora," Preston replied, drawing her close. "And your story is what brought you to me. I wouldn't change a single chapter." As the first stars appeared overhead, Nora Kendrick let go of the last shadows of her past and embraced the future that stretched before her, a future bright with promise, rich with love, and free from fear. In the arms of her cowboy, she had found not just safety, but something far more precious: the courage to believe in happiness again. 2 years later, the Silver Creek Ranch had prospered beyond Preston's original dreams. The main house, once too large for a single man, now echoed with the laughter of a family. Nora stood on the porch, watching as Preston taught their 1-year-old daughter, Emma, to pet a gentle mare. The little girl's delighted giggles carried across the yard, warming Nora's heart like nothing else could. Life wasn't perfect. There were still difficult days when memories of her past threatened to overshadow her present joy. But Preston's steady love and unwavering support had helped her build a new life where those memories held less power with each passing season. As she watched her husband lift their daughter onto his shoulders, Nora reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a frightened woman fleeing in the night to the confident mistress of Silver Creek Ranch, she had transformed not by forgetting her scars, but by embracing them as part of the tapestry of her life. "Are you coming, love?" Preston called, turning toward the house with Emma secure in his arms. "Yes," Nora replied, smiling as she stepped off the porch to join her family. "I'm right here where I belong."